Tonight I will be reading from the Maida book series by Inez Haynes Irwin, published in 1909. The story is about a sweet little girl named Maida who is sickly and lame. Her father is well known to be one of the most wealthiest men in America. He decides to buy her a little shop in Charleston, Massachusetts, to give her a purpose and to help restore her health. However, he has one condition: that she not tell anyone who she is or who her father is. And for the first time in her life, Maida makes wonderful new friends because they think she's just an ordinary girl. And so, as always, my friend, settling comfortably under the covers, take a slow, comfortable breath. And as you exhale, relax and let go. Allow any tension to just melt away, letting your body sink deeper and deeper down into the softness of your bed. There is nothing left to do and nowhere else to be. So just lay back, relax, and enjoy the story. Chapter 2: Cleaning Up. The next 2 weeks were the busiest Maida ever knew. In the first place, she must see Mrs. Murdoch and talk things over. In the second place, she must examine all the stock that Mrs. Murdoch left. In the third place, she must order new stock from the wholesale places. And in the fourth place, the rooms must be made ready for her and Granny to live in. It was hard work, but it was great fun. First, Mrs. Murdoch called, at Billy's request, at his rooms on Mount Vernon Street. Granny and Maida were there to meet her. Mrs. Murdoch was a tall, thin, erect old lady. Her bright black eyes were piercing enough, but it seemed to Maida that the round glassed spectacles through which she examined them all were even more so. "I've made out a list of things for the shop that I'm all out of," she began briskly. "You'll know what the rest is from what's left on the shelves. Now about buying. There's a wagon comes round once a month, and I've told them to keep right on coming even though I ain't there. They'll sell you your candy, pickles, pickled limes, and all such stuff. You'll have to buy your toys in Boston. Your paper, pens, pencils, rubbers, and the like also, but not at the same places where you get the toys. I've put all the addresses down on the list. I don't see how you can make any mistakes." "How long will it take you to get out of the shop?" Billy asked. Maida knew that Billy enjoyed Mrs. Murdoch, for often, when he looked at that lady, his eyes crinkled up, although there was not a smile on his face. "A week is all I need," Mrs. Murdoch declared. "If it weren't for other folks who are keeping me waiting, I'd have that whole place fixed as clean as a whistle in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail. Now I'll put a price on everything, so as you won't be bothered what to charge. There's some things I don't ever get, because folks buy too many of them, and it's such an everlasting bother keeping them in stock. But you're young and spry, and maybe you won't mind jumping about for every Tom, Dick, and Harry. But remember," she added in parting, "don't get expensive things. Folks in that neighborhood ain't got no money to fool away. Get as many things as you can for a cent apiece. Get some for 5 and less, for 10, and nothing over a quarter. But you must also calculate to buy some things to lose money on. I mean the truck you put in the window just to make folks look in. It gets dusty and fly-specked before you know it, and there's an end on it. I also send them to the home for little wanderers at Christmas time." Early one morning, a week later, a party of 3, Granny Flynn, Billy, and Maida, walked up Beacon Street and across the common to the subway. Maida had never walked so far in her life, but her father had told her that if she wanted to keep the shop, she must give up her carriage and her automobile. That was not hard. She was willing to give up anything that she owned for the little shop. They left the car at City Square in Charleston and walked the rest of the way. It was Saturday, a brilliant morning in a beautiful autumn. All the children in the neighborhood were out playing. Maida looked at each one of them as she passed. They seemed as wonderful as fairy beings to her, for would they not all be her customers soon? And yet, such was her excitement, she could not remember one face after she had passed it. A single picture remained in her mind, a picture of a little girl standing alone in the middle of the court. Black-haired, black-eyed, a vivid spot of color in a scarlet cape and a scarlet hat. The child was scattering breadcrumbs to a flock of pigeons. The pigeons did not seem afraid of her. They flew close to her feet. One even alighted on her shoulder. "It makes me think of St. Mark's in Venice," Maida said to Billy. But little girl, scarlet cape, flocks of doves, St. Mark's, all went out of her head entirely when she unlocked the door of the little shop. "Oh, oh," she cried, "how nice and clean it looks." The shop seemed even larger than she remembered. The confused, dusty, cluttery look had gone, but with its dull paint and its blackened ceiling, it still seemed dark and dingy. Maida ran behind the counter, peeped into the showcases, poked her head into the window, drew out the drawers that lined the wall, pulled covers from the boxes on the shelves. There is no knowing where her investigations would have ended if Billy had not said, "See here, Mrs. Curiosity, we can't put in the whole morning on the shop. This is a preliminary tour of investigation. Come and see the rest of it. This way to the living room." The living room led from the shop, a big square room, empty now, of course. Maida limped over to the window. "Oh," she cried, "did you ever see such a darling little yard?" "It surely is little," Billy agreed. "Not much bigger than a pocket handkerchief, is it?" And yet, scrap of a place as the yard was, it had an air of completeness, a pretty quaintness. 2 tiny brick walks curved from the door to the gate. On either side of these spread out microscopic flower beds crowded tight with plants. Late blooming dahlias and asters made spots of starry color in the green. A vine running over the door to the second story waved like a crimson banner dropped from the window. "The old lady must have been fond of flowers," Billy Potter said. He squinted his nearsighted blue eyes and studied the bunches of green. Syringa bush in one corner, lilac bush in the other, nasturtiums at the edges, morning glories running up the fence, sunflowers in between. My, won't it be fun to see them all racing up in the spring? Maida jumped up and down at the thought. She could not jump like other children. Indeed, this was the first time that she'd ever tried. It was as if her feet were like flat irons. Granny Flynn turned quickly away and Billy bit his lips. "I know just how I'm going to fix this room up for you, Petronilla," Billy said, nodding his head mysteriously. "Now let's go into the kitchen." The kitchen led from the living room. Billy exclaimed when he saw it, and Maida shook her hands, but it was Granny who actually screamed with delight. Much bigger than the living room, it had 4 windows with sunshine pouring in through every one of them. But it was not the 4 windows, nor yet the sunshine that made the sensation. It was the stone floor. "We'll put a carpet on it if you think it's too cold, Granny," Billy suggested immediately. "Oh, have it be, Mr. Billy," Granny begged. "'Tis like my old home in Ireland." "All right," Billy agreed cheerfully. "What you say goes, Granny. Now upstairs to the sleeping rooms." To get to the 2nd floor, they climbed a little stairway not more than 3 feet wide, with steps very high, most of them triangular in shape because the stairway had to turn so often. And upstairs, after they got there, consisted of 3 rooms, 2 big and square and light, and 1 smaller and darker. "The small room is to be made into a bathroom," Billy explained, "and these 2 big ones are to be your bedrooms. Which one will you have, Maida?" Maida examined both rooms carefully. "Well, I don't care for myself which I have," she said, "but it does seem as if there were a teeny wee more sun in this one. I think Granny ought to have it, for she loves the sunshine on her old bones." "You know, Billy, Granny and I have the greatest fun about our bones. Hers are all wrong because they're so old, and mine are all wrong because they're so young." "All right," Billy agreed. "Sunshiny one for Granny, shady one for you. That's settled." "I hope you realize, Miss Maida, Elizabeth, Fairfax, Petronilla, Pinkwink, Posy, Westerbrook, what perfectly bully rooms these are. They're as old as Noah." "I'm glad they're old," Maida said. "But of course they must be. This house was here when Dr. Pierce was a little boy, and that must have been a long, long time ago." "Just look at the floors," Billy went on admiringly. "See how uneven they are? You'll have to walk straight here, Petronilla, to keep from falling down. That old wooden wainscoting is simply charming. That's a nice old fireplace, too. And these old doors are perfect." Granny Flynn was working the latch of one of the old doors with her wrinkled hands. "Many's the time I've snibbed a latch like that in Ireland," she said, and she smiled so hard that her very wrinkles seemed to twinkle. "And look at the windows, Granny," Billy said. 16 panes of glass each. I hope you'll make Petronilla wash them." "Oh, Granny, will you let me wash the windows?" Maida asked ecstatically. "When you're grand and strong," Granny promised. "I know just how I'll furnish the room," Billy said half to himself. "Oh, Billy, tell me," Maida begged. "Can't," he protested mischievously. "You've got to wait till it's all finished before you see hide or hair of it." "I know I'll die of curiosity," Maida protested. "But then, of course, I shall be very busy with my own business." "Ah, yes," Billy replied. "Now that you've embarked on a mercantile career, Miss Westerbrook, I think you'll find that you'll have less and less time for the decorative side of life." Billy spoke so seriously that most little girls would have been awed by his manner, but Maida recognized the tone that he always employed when he was joking her. Besides, his eyes were all scrinkled up. She did not quite understand what the joke was, but she smiled back at him. "Now can we look at the things downstairs?" she pleaded. "Yes," Billy assented. "Today is a very important day. behind locked doors and sealed windows, were going to take account of stock. Granny Flynn remained in the bedrooms to make all kinds of mysterious measurements, to open and shut doors, to examine closets, to try window sashes, even to poke her head up the chimney. Downstairs, Billy and Maida opened boxes and boxes and boxes, and drawers and drawers and drawers. Every one of these had been carefully gone over by the conscientious Mrs. Murdoch. 2 boxes bulged with toys, too broken or soiled to be of any use. These they threw in the ash barrel at once. What was left they dumped on the floor. Maida and Billy sat down beside the heap and examined the things one by one. Maida had never seen such toys in her life, so cheap and yet so amusing. It was hard work to keep to business with such enchanting temptation to play all about them. Billy insisted on spinning every top. He got 5 going at once. On blowing every balloon, he produced such dreadful wails of agony that Granny came running downstairs in great alarm. On jumping with every jump rope, the short ones tripped him up, and once he sprawled headlong. On playing jackstones, Maida beat him easily at this. On playing marbles, with a piece of crayon he drew a ring on the floor. On looking through all the books, he declared that he was going to buy some little penny pamphlet fairy tales as soon as he could save the money. But in spite of all this fooling, they really accomplished a great deal. They found very few eatables, candy, fruit, or the like. Mrs. Murdoch had wisely sold out this perishable stock. 1 glass jar, however, was crammed full of what Billy recognized to be bullseyes, round lumps of candy as big as plums and as hard as stones. Billy said he loved bullseyes better than broiled live lobster, that he had not tasted one since he was 10:30. For the rest of the day, one of his cheeks stuck out as if he had a toothache. They came across all kinds of odds and ends: lead pencils, blank books, an old slate pencil wrapped in gold paper which Billy insisted on using to draw pictures on a slate. He made this squeak so that Maida clapped her hands over her ears. They found single pieces from sets of miniature furniture, a great many dolls, rag dolls, china dolls, celluloid dolls, and 2 old-fashioned waxen darlings whose features had all run together from being left in too great a heat. They went through all these things, sorting them into heaps, which they afterwards placed in boxes. At noon, Billy went out and bought lunch. Still squatting on the floor, the 3 of them ate sandwiches and drank milk. Granny said that Maida had never eaten so much at one meal. All this happened on Saturday. Maida did not see the little shop again until it was finished. By Monday, the place was as busy as a beehive. Men were putting in a furnace, putting in a telephone, putting in a bathroom, whitening the plaster, painting the woodwork. Finally came 2 days of waiting for the paint to dry. Will it ever, ever, ever dry? Maida used to ask Billy on the most despairing of voices. By Thursday, the rooms were ready for their second coat of paint. "Oh, Billy, do tell me what color it is. I can't wait to see it," Maida begged. But sky blue pink was all she got from Billy. Saturday, the furniture came. In the meantime, Maida had been going to all the principal wholesale places in Boston, picking out new stock. Granny Flynn accompanied her or stayed at home according to the way she felt, but Billy never missed a trip. Maida enjoyed this tremendously, although often she had to go to bed before dark. She said it was the responsibility that tired her. To Maida, these big wholesale places seemed like storehouses of Santa Claus. In reality, they were great halls lined with parallel rows of counters. The counters were covered with boxes, and the boxes were filled with toys. Along the aisles between the counters moved crowds of buyers, busily examining the display. It was particularly hard for Maida to choose because she was limited by price. She kept recalling Mrs. Murdoch's advice: get as many things as you can for a cent apiece. The expensive toys tempted her, but although she often stopped and looked them wistfully over, she always ended by going to the cheaper counters. You ought to be thinking how you'll decorate the windows for your first day's sale, Billy advised her. You must make it look as tempting as possible. I think, myself, it's always a good plan to display the toys that go with the season. Maida thought of this a great deal after she went to bed at night. By the end of the week, she could see in imagination just how her windows were going to look. Saturday night, Billy told her that everything was ready, that she should see the completed house Monday morning. It seemed to Maida that the Sunday coming in between was the longest day that she'd ever known. When she unlocked the door to the shop the next morning, she let out a little squeal of joy. "Oh, I would never know it," she declared. "How much bigger it looks, and lighter and prettier." Indeed, you would never have known the place yourself. The ceiling had been whitened. The faded drab woodwork had been painted white. The walls had been colored a beautiful soft yellow. Back of the counter, a series of shelves, glassed in by sliding doors, ran the whole length of the wall and nearly to the ceiling. Behind the showcase stood a comfortable, cushioned swivel chair. "The stuff you've been buying, Petronella," Billy said, pointing to a big pile of boxes in the corner. "Now, while Granny and I are putting some last touches to the room upstairs, you might be arranging the window." "That's just what I plan to do," Maida said, bubbling with importance. "But you promise not to interrupt me till it's done." "All right," Billy agreed, smiling. He continued to smile as he opened the boxes. It did not occur to Maida to ask them what they were going to do upstairs. It did not occur to her even to go up there. From time to time, she heard Granny and Billy laughing. One of Billy's jokes, she said to herself. Once, she thought she heard the chirp of a bird, but she would not leave her work to find out what it was. When the 12 o'clock whistle blew, she called to Granny and to Billy to come see the results of her morning's labor. "I say," Billy emitted a long, loud whistle. "Oh, do you like it?" Maida asked anxiously. "It's a grand piece of work, Petronella," Billy said heartily. The window certainly struck the keynote of the season. Tops of all sizes and colors were arranged in pretty patterns in the middle. Marbles of all kinds, from the 10 for a cent pea-weezers up to the most beautiful colored agates, were displayed at the sides. Jump ropes of variegated colors with the handles, brilliantly painted, were festooned at the back. One of the window shelves had been furnished like a tiny room. A whole family of dolls sat about on the tiny sofas and chairs. On the other shelf lay neat piles of blank books and paper blocks, with files of pens, pencils, and rubbers arranged in a decorative pattern surrounding them all. In the showcase, fresh candies had been laid out carefully on saucers and platters of glass. On the counter was a big flowered bowl. Tomorrow, I'm going to fill that bowl with asters, Maida explained. Oh, I'm sure the child has done fine, Granny Flynn said. I couldn't have done better myself. Now come and look at your rooms, Petronilla, Billy begged, his eyes dancing. Maida opened the door leading into the living room. Then she squealed her delight, not once, but continuously, like a very happy little pig. The room was as changed as if some good fairy had waved a magic wand there. All the woodwork had turned a glistening white. The wallpaper blossomed with garlands of red roses tied with snoods of red ribbons. At each of the 3 windows waved sash curtains of a snowy muslin. At each of the 3 sashes hung a golden cage with a pair of golden canaries in it. Along each of the 3 sills marched pots of brilliantly blooming scarlet geraniums. A fire spluttered and sparkled in the fireplace, and drawn up in front of it was a big easy chair for Granny and a small easy one for Maida. Familiar things lay about too. In one corner gleamed the cheerful face of the tall old clock which marked the hours with so silvery a voice and the moon changes by such pretty pictures. In another corner shone the polished surface of a spidery-legged little spinet. Maida loved both these things almost as much as if they had been human beings, for her mother and her grandmother and her great-grandmother had loved them before her. Needed things caught her eyes everywhere. Here was a little bookcase with all her favorite books. There was a desk, stocked with business-like-looking blank books. Even the familiar table with Granny's Book of Saints stood near the easy chair. Granny's spectacles lay on an open page marking the place. In the center of the room stood a table set for 3. It's just the dearest place, Maida said. Billy, you've remembered everything. I thought I heard a bird peep once, but I was too busy to think about it. Want to go upstairs? Billy asked. I'd forgotten all about bedrooms. Maida flew up the stairs as if she had never known a crutch. The 2 bedrooms were very simple, all white woodwork, furniture, beds, even the fur rugs on the floor. But they were wonderfully gay from the beautiful paper that Billy had selected. In Granny's room, the walls imitated a flower chintz. But in Maida's room, every panel was different, and they all helped to tell the same happy story of a day's hunting in the time when men wore long feathered hats on their curls, when ladies dressed like pictures, and all carried falcons on their wrists. Granny, Maida called down to them, did you ever see any place in all your life that felt so homey? I guess it will do, Billy said in an undertone. That night, for the first time, Maida slept in the room over the little shop. Chapter 3: The First Day. If you had gone into the little shop the next day, you would have seen a very pretty picture. First of all, I think you would have noticed the little girl who sat behind the counter. A little girl in a simple blue serge dress and a fresh white tire. A little girl with shining, excited eyes and masses of pale gold hair clinging in tenderly rings about a thin, heart-shaped face. A little girl who kept saying as she turned round and round in her swivel chair, "Oh, Granny, do you think anybody's going to buy anything today?" Next, I think you would have noticed an old woman who kept coming to the living room door. An old woman in a black gown and a white apron so stiffly starched that it rattled when it touched anything. An old woman with twinkling blue eyes and hair, enclosing, as in a silver frame, a little carved nut of a face. An old woman who kept soothing the little girl with a cheery, "Now just you be patient, my lamb. Sure somebody'll be here soon." The shop was unchanged since yesterday, except for a big bowl of asters, red, white, and blue. 3 cheers for the red, white, and blue, Maida sang when she arranged them. She had been singing at intervals ever since. Suddenly, the latch slipped. The bell rang. Maida jumped. Then she sat so still in her high chair that you would have thought she had turned to stone. But her eyes, glued to the moving door, had a look as if she did not know what to expect. The door swung wide. A young man entered. It was Billy Potter. He walked over to the showcase, his hat in his hand, and all the time he looked Maida straight in the eye, but you would have thought he had never seen her before. "Please, Mum," he asked humbly, "do you sell fairy tales here?" Maida saw at once that it was one of Billy's games. She had to bite her lips to keep from laughing. "Yes," she said, when she had made her mouth quite firm. "How much do you want to pay for them?" "Not more than a penny each, Mum," he replied. Maida took out of a drawer the pamphlet tales that Billy had liked so much. "Are these what you want?" she asked. But before he could answer, she added in a condescending tone, "Do you know how to read, little boy?" Billy's face twitched suddenly and his eyes wrinkled up. Maida saw with a mischievous delight that he, in his turn, was trying to keep the laughter back. "Yes, Mum," he said, making his face quite serious again. "My teacher says I'm the best reader in the room." He took up the little books and looked them over. "The 3 bears," he corrected himself. "Puss in Boots, Boots. Jack and the Beanscalp, Stalk. Jack the Joint Cooler, Giant Killer. Cinderella, Bluebird, Bluebeard. Little Tooty Goo Shoes, Little Goody Two Shoes. Tom Thumb, The Sweeping Beauty, The Babes in the Wood. I guess I'll take these 10, Mum." He felt in all his pockets one after another. After a long time, he brought out some pennies. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, he counted slowly. He took the books, turned, and left the shop. Maida watched him in astonishment. Was he really going for good? In a few minutes, the little bell tinkled a second time, and there stood Billy again. "Good morning, Petronilla," he said pleasantly, as if he had not seen her before that morning. "How's business?" "Fine," Maida responded promptly. "I've just sold 10 fairy books to the funniest little boy you ever saw." "My stars and garters," Billy exclaimed. "Business surely is brisk. Keep that up and you can afford to have a cat. I've brought you something." He opened the bag he carried and took a box out from it. "Hold out your 2 hands. It's heavy," he warned. In spite of his preparation, the box nearly fell to the floor. It was so much heavier than Maida expected. "What can be in it?" she cried excitedly. She pulled the cover off, then murmured a little "oh" of delight. The box was full, cram-jam full, of pennies, pennies so new that they looked like gold, pennies so many that they looked like a fortune. "Gracious, what pretty money!" Maida exclaimed. "There must be 1,000,000 here." 500, Billy corrected her. He put some tiny cylindrical rolls of paper on the counter. Maida handled them curiously. They, too, were heavy. "Open them," Billy commanded. Maida pulled the papers away from the tops. Bright new dimes fell out of one. Bright new nickels came from the other. "Oh, I'm so glad to have nice clean money," Maida said in a satisfied tone. She emptied the money drawer and filled its pockets with the shining coins. "It was very kind of you to think of it, Billy. I know it will please the children." The thought made her eyes sparkle. The bell rang again. Billy went out to talk with Granny, leaving Maida alone to cope with her first strange customer. Again, her heart began to jump into her throat. Her mouth felt dry on the inside. She watched the door, fascinated. On the threshold, 2 little girls were standing. They were exactly of the same size. They were dressed in exactly the same way. Their faces were alike as 2 peas in a pod. Maida saw at once that they were twins. They had little round, chubby bodies bulging out of red sweaters, little round, chubby faces emerging from tall, peaky, red worsted caps. They had big, round eyes, as expressionless as glass beads, and big, round, golden curls, as stiff as candles. They stared so hard at Maida that she began to wonder nervously if her face were dirty. "Come in, little girls," she called. The little girls pattered over to the showcase and looked in. But their big round eyes, instead of examining the candy, kept peering up through the glass top at Maida, and Maida kept peering down through it at them. "I want to buy some candy for a cent," one of them whispered in a timid little voice. "I want to buy some candy for a cent, too," the other whispered in a voice even more timid. "All the cent candy is in this case," Maida explained, smiling. "What are you going to have, Dorothy?" one of them asked. "I don't know. What are you going to have, Mabel?" the other asked. They discussed everything in the 1-cent case. Always they talked in whispers, and they continued to look more often at Maida than at the candy. "Have you anything, too, for a cent?" Mabel whispered finally. "Oh, yes, all the candy in this corner." The 2 little girls studied the corner Maida indicated. For 2 or 3 moments they whispered together. At one point, it looked as if they would each buy a long stick of peppermint, at another, a paper of lozenges. But they changed their minds a great many times, and in the end, Dorothy bought 2 large pickles, and Mabel bought 2 large chocolates. Maida saw them swapping their purchases as they went out. The 2 pennies which the twins handed her were still moist from the hot little hands that had held them. Maida dropped them into an empty pocket in the money drawer. She felt as if she wanted to keep her first earnings forever. It seemed to her that she had never seen such precious-looking money. The gold eagles which her father had given her at Christmas and on her birthday did not seem half so valuable. But she did not have much time to think of all this. The bell rang again. This time it was a boy. A big fellow of about 14, she guessed, an untidy-looking boy with large, intent black eyes. A mass of black hair, which surely had not been combed, fell about a face that as certainly had not been washed that morning. "Give me one of those blue tops in the window," he said gruffly. He did not add these words, but his manner seemed to say, "And be quick about it." He threw his money down on the counter so hard that one of the pennies spun off into a corner. He did not offer to pick the penny up. He did not even apologize, and he looked very carefully at the top Maida handed him as if he expected her to cheat him. Then he walked out. It was getting towards school time. Children seemed to spring up everywhere as if they grew out of the ground. The quiet streets began to ring with the cries of boys playing tag, leapfrog, and prisoner's base. The little girls, much more quiet, squatted in groups on doorsteps or walked slowly up and down arm in arm. But Maida had little time to watch this picture. The bell was ringing every minute now. Once there were 6 children in the little shop together. "Do you need any help?" Granny called. "No, Granny, not yet," Maida answered cheerfully. But just the same, she did have to hurry. The children asked her for all kinds of things, and sometimes she could not remember where she had put them. When in answer to the school bell, the long lines began to form at the big doorways, 2 round red spots were glowing in Maida's cheeks. She drew an involuntary sigh of relief when she realized that she was going to have a chance to rest. But first, she counted the money she had taken in. 37 cents. It seemed a great deal to her. For an hour more, nobody entered the shop. Billy left in a little while for Boston. Granny, crooning an old Irish song, busied herself upstairs in her bedroom. Maida sat back in her chair, dreaming happily of her work. Suddenly, the bell tinkled, rousing her with a start. It seemed a long time after the bell rang before the door opened, but at last Maida saw the reason of the delay. The little boy who stood on the threshold was lame. Maida would have known that he was sick even if she had not seen the crutches that held him up or the iron cage that confined one leg. His face was as colorless as if it had been made of melted wax. His forehead was lined almost as if he were old. A tired expression in his eyes showed that he did not sleep like other children. He must often suffer, too. His mouth had a drawn look that Maida knew well. The little boy moved slowly over to the counter. It could hardly be said that he walked. He seemed to swing between his crutches exactly as a pendulum swings in a tall clock. Perhaps he saw the sympathy that ran from Maida's warm heart to her pale face. For before he spoke, he smiled, and when he smiled, you could not possibly think of him as sick or sad. The corners of his mouth and the corners of his eyes seemed to fly up together. It made your spirits leap just to look at him. "I'd like a sheet of red tissue paper," he said briskly. Maida's happy expression changed. It was the first time that anybody had asked her for anything which she did not have. "I'm afraid I haven't any," she said regretfully. The boy looked disappointed. He started to go away. Then he turned hopefully. "Mrs. Murdoch always kept her tissue paper in that drawer there," he said, pointing. "Oh, yes, I do remember," Maida exclaimed. She recalled now a few sheets of tissue paper that she had left there, not knowing what to do with them. She pulled the drawer open. There they were, neatly folded as she had left them. "What did Mrs. Murdoch charge for it?" she inquired. "1 cent a sheet." Maida thought busily. "I'm selling out all the old stock," she said. "You can have all that's left for 1 cent if you want it." "Sure," the boy exclaimed. "That's a stroke of luck I wasn't expecting." He spread the 6 sheets out on the counter and ran through them. He looked up into Maida's face as if he wanted to thank her but did not know how to put it. Instead, he stared about the shop. "Say," he exclaimed, "you've made this door look grand. I'd never know it for the same place. And your sign's a crackajack." The praise, the first she had had from outside, pleased Maida. It emboldened her to go on with the conversation. "You don't go to school," she said. The moment she had spoken, she regretted it. It was plain to see, she reproached herself inwardly, why he did not go to school. "No," the boy said soberly. "I can't go yet. Dr. O'Brien says I can go next year, he thinks. I'm wild to go. The other fellows hate school, but I love it. I suppose it's because I can't go that I want to. But then, I want to learn to read. A fellow can have a good time anywhere if he knows how to read. I can read some," he added in a shamed tone, "but not much. The trouble is, I don't have anybody to listen and help with the hard words." "Oh, let me help you," Maida cried. "I can read as easy as anything." This was the second thing she regretted saying, for when she came to think of it, she could not see where she was going to have much time to herself. But the little lame boy shook his head. "Can't," he said decidedly. "You see, I'm busy at home all day long, and you'll be busy here. My mother works out and I have to do most of the housework and take care of the baby. Pretty slow work on crutches, you know, although it's easy enough getting round after you get the hang of it. No, I really don't have any time to fool until evenings." "Evenings," Maida exclaimed electrically. "Why, that's just the right time. You see, I'm pretty busy myself during the daytime at my business." Her voice grew a little important on that last phrase. "Granny, Granny," she called. Granny Flynn appeared in the doorway. Her eyes grew soft with pity when they fell on the little lame boy. "The poor little gossoon," she murmured. "Granny," Maida explained, "this little boy can't go to school because his mother works all day and he has to do the housework and take care of the baby too. And he wants to learn to read because he thinks he won't be half so lonely with books. And you know, Granny, that's perfectly true, for I never suffered half so much with my legs after I learned to read." It had all poured out in an uninterrupted stream. She had to stop here to get a breath. "Now, Granny, what I want you to do is to let me hear him read evenings until he learns how. You see, his mother comes home then, and he can leave the baby with her. Oh, do let me do it, Granny. I'm sure I could. And I really think you ought to. For, if you'll excuse me for saying so, Granny, I don't think you can understand as well as I do what a difference it will make." She turned to the boy. "Have you read Little Men and Little Women?" "No, why, I'm only in the first reader." "I'll read them to you," Maida said decisively, "and Treasure Island, and The Princes and the Goblins, and The Princess and Curdie." She reeled off the long list of her favorites. In the meantime, Granny was considering the matter. Dr. Pierce had said to her of Maida, let her do anything that she wants to do, as long as it doesn't interfere with her eating and sleeping. The main thing to do is to get her to want to do things. "What's your name, my lad?" she asked. "Dickie Dorr, ma'am," the boy answered respectfully. "Well, I don't see why you shouldn't try," she said to Maida. "A half an hour every evening after dinner." "We'll begin next week, Monday," Maida said eagerly. "You come over here right after dinner." "All right." The little lame boy looked very happy, but, again, he did not seem to know what to say. "Thank you, ma'am," he brought out finally, "and you too," turning to Maida. "My name's Maida." "Thank you, Maida," the boy said, with even a greater display of bashfulness. He settled the crutches under his thin shoulders. "Oh, don't go yet," Maida pleaded. "I want to ask you some questions. Tell me the name of those dear little girls, the twins." Dickie Dorr smiled his radiant smile. "Their last name's Clark. Say, ain't they dead ringers for each other? I can't tell Dorothy from Mabel or Mabel from Dorothy." "I can't either," Maida laughed. "It must be fun to be a twin, to have any kind of a sister or brother." "Who's that big boy? The one with the hair all hanging down on his face?" "Oh, that's Arthur Duncan." Dickie's whole face shone. "He's a dandy. He can lick any boy of his size in the neighborhood. I bet he could lick any boy of his size in the world. I bet he could lick his weight in wildcats." Maida's brow wrinkled. "I don't like him," she said. "He's not polite." "Well, I like him," Dickie Dorr maintained stoutly. "He's the best friend I've got anywhere. Arthur hasn't any mother, and his father's gone all day. He takes care of himself. He comes over to my place a lot. You'll like him when you know him." The bell tinkling on his departure did not ring again till noon, but Maida did not mind. "Granny," she said after Dickie left, "I think I've made a friend. Not a friend somebody's brought to me, but a friend of my very own. Just think of that." At 12, Maida watched the children pour out of the little schoolhouse and disappear in all directions. At 2, she watched them reappear from all directions and pour into it again. But between those hours, she was so busy that she did not have time to eat her lunch until school began again. After that, she sat undisturbed for an hour. In the middle of the afternoon, the bell rang with an important sounding tinkle. Immediately after, the door shut with an important sounding slam. The footsteps, clattering across the room to the showcase, had an important sounding tap, and the little girl, who looked inquisitively across the counter at Maida, had decidedly an important manner. She was not a pretty child. Her skin was too pasty, her blue eyes too full and staring. But she had beautiful braids of glossy brown hair that came below her waist, and you would have noticed her at once because of the air with which she wore her clothes and because of a trick of holding her head very high. Maida could see that she was dressed very much more expensively than the other children in the neighborhood. Her dark blue coat was elaborate with straps and bright buttons. Her pale blue beaver hat was covered with pale blue feathers. She wore a gold ring with a turquoise in it, a silver bracelet with a monogram on it, a little gunmetal watch pinned to her coat with a gunmetal pin, and a long string of blue beads from which dangled a locket. Maida noticed all this decoration with envy, for she herself was never permitted to wear jewelry. Occasionally, Granny would let her wear one string from a big box of bead necklaces which Maida had bought in Venice. "How much is this candy?" the girl asked, pointing to one of the trays. Maida told her. "Dear me, haven't you anything better than that?" Maida gave her all the prices. "I'm afraid there's nothing good enough here," the little girl went on disdainfully. "My mother won't let me eat cheap candy. Generally, she has a box sent over twice a week from Boston, but the one we expected today didn't come." The little girl likes to make people think that she has nicer things than anybody else, Maida thought. She started to speak. If she had permitted herself to go on, she would have said, "The candy in this shop is quite good enough for any little girl, but I won't sell it to you anyway." But instead, she said as quietly as she could, "No, I don't believe there's anything here that you'll care for. but I'm sure you'll find lots of expensive candy on Main Street." The little girl evidently was not expecting that answer. She lingered, still looking into the showcase. "I guess I'll take 5 cents worth of peppermints," she said finally. Some of the importance had gone out of her voice. Maida put the candy into a bag and handed it to her without speaking. The girl bustled towards the door. Halfway, she stopped and came back. "My name is Laura Lathrop," she said. "What's yours?" "Maida." "Maida?" the girl repeated questioningly. "Maida? Oh, yes, I know, Maida Flynn. Where did you live before you came here?" "Oh, lots of places." "But where?" Laura persisted. "Boston, New York, Newport, Pride's Crossing, Europe." "Oh, my. Have you been to Europe?" Laura's tone was a little incredulous. "I lived abroad a year." "Can you speak French?" "Oui, mademoiselle. Je parle français un peu." "Say some more," Laura demanded. Maida smiled. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Laura looked impressed. "Do you speak any other language?" "Italian and German, a very little." Laura stared at her hard, and her look was full of question, but it was evident that she decided to believe Maida. "I live in Primrose Court," she said, and now there was not a shadow of condescension left in her voice. "That large house at the back with the big lawn about it. I'd like to have you come and play with me some afternoon. I'm very busy most of the time, though. I take music and fancy dancing. Next winter, I'm going to take up French. I'll send you word some afternoon when I have time to play." "Thank you," Maida said in her most civil voice. "Come and play with me sometime," she added after a pause. "Oh, my mother doesn't let me play in other children's houses," Laura said airily. "Goodbye." "Goodbye," Maida answered. She waited until Laura had disappeared into the court. "Granny," she called out, "a little girl's been here who I think is the hatefulest, horridest, disagreeablest thing I ever saw in my life." "Why, what did that child do?" Granny asked in surprise. "Do?" Maida repeated. "She did everything. Why, she interrupted herself to think hard a moment. "Well, it's the strangest thing. I can't tell you a thing she did, Granny, and yet all the time she was here I wanted to slap her." "There's many folks that-a-way," said Granny. "The wisest way is to take no notice of it." "Take no notice of it," Maida stormed. "It's just like not taking any notice of a bee when it's stinging you." Maida was so angry that she walked into the living room without limping. At 4 that afternoon, when the children came out of school, there was another flurry of trade. Towards 5 it slackened. Maida sat in her swivel chair and wistfully watched the scene in the court. Little boys were playing top. Little girls were jumping rope. Once she saw a little girl in a scarlet cape come out of one of the yards. On one shoulder perched a fluffy kitten. Following her, an Irish setter and a Skye Terrier. Presently, it grew dark, and the children began to go indoors. Maida lighted the gas and lost herself in Gulliver's Travels. The sound of voices attracted her attention after a while. She turned in her chair. Outside, staring into the window, stood a little boy and girl, a ragged, dirty pair. Their noses pressed so hard against the glass that they were flattened into round white circles. They took no notice of Maida. Dropping her eyes to her book, she pretended to read. "I bonies that red top first," said the little boy in a piping voice. He was a round, brown, pop-eyed, big-mouthed little creature. Maida could not decide which he looked most like, a frog or a brownie. She christened him the Bogle at once. "I bonies that little pink doll with the curly hair first," said the girl. She was a round, brown little creature too, but pretty. She had merry brown eyes and a merry little red and white smile. Maida christened her the Robin. "I bonies that big agate second," said the Bogle. "I bonies that little table second," said the Robin. "I bonies that knife third," said the Bogle. "I bonies that little chair third," said the Robin. Maida could not imagine what kind of game they were playing. She went to the door. "Come in, children," she called. The children jumped and started to run away, but they stopped a little way off, turned and stood as if they were not certain what to do. Finally, the Robin marched over to Maida's side and the Bogle followed. "Tell me about the game you were playing," Maida said. "I never heard of it before." "That wasn't any game," the Bogle said. "We were just bonying," the Robin explained. "Didn't you ever bony anything?" "No." "Why, you bonies things in your store windows," the Robin went on. "You always bony with somebody else. You choose one thing for yours, and they choose something else for theirs until everything in the window is all chosen up. But of course, they don't really belong to you. You only play they do." "I see," Maida said. She went to the window and took out the red top and the little pink doll with curly hair. "Here, these are the things you bonied first. You may have them." "Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you," the Robin exclaimed. She kissed the little pink doll ecstatically, stopping now and then to look gratefully at Maida. "Thank you," the Bogle echoed. He did not look at Maida, but he began at once to wind his top. "What's your name?" Maida asked. "Molly Doyle," the Robin answered, "and this is my brother Timmy Doyle." "My name's Maida. Come and see me again, Molly, and you too, Timmy." "Of course I'll come," Molly answered, "and I'm going to name my doll Maida." Molly ran all the way home, her doll tightly clutched to her breast. But Timmy stopped to spin his top 6 times, Maida counted. No more customers came that evening. At 6, Maida closed and locked the shop. After dinner, she thought she would read one of her new books. She settled herself in her little easy chair by the fire and opened to a story with a fascinating picture. But the moment her eyes fell on the page, it was the strangest thing. A drowsiness, as deep as a fairy's enchantment, fell upon her. She struggled with it for a while, but she could not throw it off. The next thing she knew, Granny was helping her up the stairs, was undressing her, had laid her in her bed. The next thing she was saying dreamily, "I made $1.87 today. If my papa ever gets into any more trouble in Wall Street, he can borrow from me." The next thing, she felt the pillow soft and cool under her cheek. The next thing, bright sunlight was pouring through the window. It was morning again. Chapter 4. The Second Day. It had rained all that night, but the second morning dawned the twinklingest kind of day. It seemed to Maida that Mother Nature had washed a million tiny, fleecy white clouds and hung them out to dry in the crisp blue air. Everything still dripped, but the brilliant sunshine put a sparkle on the whole world. Slates of old roofs glistened, brasses of old doors glittered, silver of old nameplates shone. Curbstones, sidewalks, doorsteps glimmered and gleamed. The wet ebony black trunks of the maples smoked as if they were afire. Their thick-leaved golden heads flared like burning torches. Maida stood for a long time at the window, listening to a parrot who called at intervals from somewhere in the neighborhood. "Get up, you sleepyheads! Get up! Get up!" A huge puddle stretched across Primrose Court. When Maida took her place in the swivel chair, 3 children had begun already to float shingles across its muddy expanse. 2 of them were Molly and Tim Doyle, the third a little girl whom Maida did not know. For a time she watched them, fascinated. But presently, the school children crowding into the shop took all her attention. After the bell rang and the neighborhood had become quiet again, she resumed her watch of the mud puddle fun. Now they were loading their shingles with leaves, twigs, pebbles, anything that they could find in the gutters. As they trotted in the wake of their frail craft, they managed to sail them from one end of the puddle to the other. Maida followed the progress of these merchant vessels as breathlessly as their owners. Some capsized utterly. Others started to founder and had to be dragged ashore. A few brought the cruise to a triumphant finish, but Tim soon put an end to this fun. Unexpectedly, his foot caught somewhere, and he sprawled headlong in the tide. "Oh, Tim," Molly said, but she said it without surprise or anger. And Tim lay flat on his stomach without moving, as if it were a common occurrence with him. Molly waded out to him, picked him up, and marched him into the house. The other little girl had disappeared. Suddenly, she came out of one of the yards, clasping a teddy bear and a whole family of dolls in her fat arms. She sat down at the puddle's edge and began to undress them. Maida idly watched the busy little fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now there were 6 shivering babies. What was she going to do with them? Maida wondered. "Granny," Maida called, "do come and see this little girl. She's—" But Maida did not finish that sentence in words. It ended in a scream, for suddenly the little girl threw the teddy bear and all the 6 dolls into the puddle. Maida ran out the door. Halfway across the court, she met Dickie Dorr swinging through the water. Between them, they fished all the dolls out. One was of celluloid and another of rubber. They had floated into the middle of the pond. 2 china babies had sunk to the very bottom. Their white faces smiled placidly up through the water at their rescuers. A little rag doll lay close to the shore, waterlogged. A pretty paper doll had melted into a pulp. And the biggest and prettiest of them, a lovely blonde creature with a shapely jointed body and a bisque head covered with golden curls, looked hopelessly bedraggled. "Oh, Betsy Hale," Dickie said. "You naughty, naughty girl. How could you drown your own children like that?" "I were giving them a bath," Betsy explained. Betsy was a little round butterball of a girl, with great brown eyes all tangled up in eyelashes and a little pink rosebud of a mouth folded over 2 rows of mice teeth. She smiled deliciously up into Maida's face. "I aren't naughty, is I?" she asked. "Naughty? You bunny duck, of course you are," Maida said, giving her a bear hug. "I don't see how anybody can scold her," she whispered to Dickie. "Scold her? You can't," Dickie said disgustedly. "She's too cute. And then if you did scold her, it wouldn't do any good. She's the naughtiest baby in the neighborhood, although," he added with pride, "I think Delia's going to be pretty nearly as naughty when she gets big enough. But Betsy Hale, why, the whole street has to keep an eye on her. Come pick up your dollies, Betsy," he wheedled. "They'll get cold if you leave them out here." The thought of danger to her darlings produced immediate activity on Betsy's part. She gathered the dolls under her cape, hugging them close. "Her must put her dollies to bed," she said wisely. "Calls herself her half the time," Dickie explained. He gathered up the dresses and, shooing Betsy ahead of him, followed her into the yard. "She's the greatest child I ever saw," he said, rejoining Maida a little later. "The things she thinks of to do. Why, the other day, Miss Allison, the sister of the blind lady what sits in the window and knits, the one what owns the parrot, well, Miss Allison painted one of her old chairs red and put it out in the yard to dry. Then she washed a whole lot of lace and put that out to dry. Next thing she knew, she looked out, and there was Betsy, washing all the red paint off the chair with the lace. You'd have thought that that would have been enough for one day, wouldn't you? Well, that afternoon, she turned the hose on Mr. Flanagan. That's the policeman on the beat." "What did he say?" Maida asked in alarm. She had a vague imaginary picture of Betsy being dragged to the station house. "Roared. But then Mr. Flanagan thinks Betsy's all right. Always calls her Sophie Sparkles. Betsy runs away about twice a week. Mr. Flanagan's always finding her and lugging her home. I guess every policeman in Charleston knows her by this time. There, look at her now. Did you ever see such a kid?" Betsy had come out of the yard again. She was carrying a huge feather duster over her head as if it were a parasol. "The darling," Maida said joyously. "I hope she'll do something naughty every day." "Strange how you love a naughty child," Dick said musingly. "They're an awful lot of trouble, but you can't help liking them." "Has Tim Doyle fallen in the puddle yet?" "Yes, just a little while ago." "He's always falling in mud puddles. I guess if Molly fishes him out once after a rain, she does a half a dozen times." "Do come and see me, Dickie, won't you?" Maida asked when they got to the shop door. "You know I shall be lonely when all the children are in school. And then, besides, you're the first friend I've made." At the word friend, Dickie's beautiful smile shone bright. "Sure, I'll come," he said heartily. "I'll come often." "Granny," Maida exclaimed, bursting into the kitchen. "Wait until you hear about Betsy Hale." She told the whole story. "Was I ever a naughty little girl?" she concluded. "Naughty? Glory be, and what's ailing you? You were the best child this side of heaven, that you were. Always so sick, and yet never a cross word out of you." A shadow fell over Maida's face. "Oh, dear, dear," she grieved. "I wish I had been a naughty child. People love naughty children so. Are you quite sure I was always good, Granny?" "You were too sick to be naughty. You could hardly lift one little hand from the bed." "But, Granny dear," Maida persisted, "can't you think of one single naughty thing I did? I'm sure you can if you try hard. Maida's face was touched with a kind of a sad wistfulness. Granny looked down at her, considerably puzzled. Then a light seemed to break in her mind. It shone through her blue eyes and twinkled in her smile. Sure, I remember once when I was giving you some medicine and you were mad for having to take that stuff, that you sat up in bed and knocked every bottle off the table. Every one. We picked up glass for a whole week after. Maida's wistful look vanished in a peal of silvery laughter. Did I really, Granny? She asked in delight. Did I break every bottle? Are you sure? Every one? Every one, said Granny with a smile. Maida bounded back to the shop in high spirits. Granny heard her say, every bottle, again and again in a whispering little voice. Just think, Granny, she called after a while. I've made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 friends. Dickie, Molly, Tim, Betsy, and Laura, though I don't call her quite a friend yet. Pretty good for so soon. Maida was to make a 6th friend, although not quite so quickly. It began that noontime with a strange little scene that acted itself out in front of Maida's window. The children had begun to gather for school, although it was still very quiet. Suddenly, around the corner came a wild hullabaloo. The shouts of small boys, the yelp of a dog, the rattle and clang of tin dragged on the brick sidewalk. In another instant appeared a dog, a small, yellow cur, collarless and forlorn-looking, with a string of tin cans tied to his tail, a horde of small boys yelling after him and pelting him with stones. Maida started up, but before she could get to the door, something flashed like a scarlet comet from across the street. It was the little girl whom Maida had seen twice before, the one who always wore the scarlet cape. Even in the excitement, Maida noticed how handsome she was. She seemed proud. She carried her slender, erect little body as if she were a princess, and her big eyes cast flashing glances about her. Jet black were her eyes and hair, milk white were her teeth, but in the olive of her cheeks flamed a red such as could be matched only in the deepest roses. Maida christened her Rose Red at once. Rose Red lifted the little dog into her arms with a single swoop of her strong arm. She yanked the cans from its tail with a single indignant jerk. Fondling the trembling creature against her cheek, she talked first to him, then to his abashed persecutors. You sweet little darling puppy, you. Did they tie wicked cans to your poor little tail? And then, if ever I catch one of you boys treating a poor helpless animal like this again, I'll shake the breath out of your body. Isn't he the most beautiful dog that ever was? And if that isn't enough, Arthur Duncan will lick you all, won't you, Arthur? She turned pleadingly to Arthur. Arthur nodded. Nobody's going to hurt helpless creatures while I'm about. He was a sweet little, precious little, pretty little puppy, so he was. Rose Red marched into the court with the puppy, opened a gate, and dropped him inside. That pup belongs to me now, she said, marching back. The school bell ringing at this moment ended the scene. Who's that little girl who wears the scarlet cape? Maida asked Dorothy and Mabel Clark when they came in together at 4. Rosie Brine, they answered in chorus. She's a dreadful naughty girl, Mabel said in a whisper, and my mommer won't let me play with her, Dorothy added. Why not? Maida asked. She's a tomboy, Mabel informed her. What's a tomboy? Maida asked Billy that night at dinner. A tomboy? Billy repeated. Why, a tomboy is a girl who acts like a boy. How can a girl be a boy? Maida queried after a few moments of thought. Why don't they call her a tomgirl? Why, indeed, Billy answered, taking up the dictionary. Certainly, Rosie Brine acted like a boy. Maida proved that to herself in the next few days when she watched Rose Red again and again. But if she were a tomboy, she was also, Maida decided, the most beautiful and the most wonderful little girl in the world. And, indeed, Rosie was so full of energy that it seemed to spurt out in the continual sparkle of her face and the continual movement of her body. She never walked. She always crossed the street in a series of flying jumps. She never went through a gate if she could go over the fence, never climbed the fence if she could vault it. The scarlet cape was always flashing up trees, over sheds, sometimes to the very roofs of the houses. Her principal diversion seemed to be climbing lamp posts. Maida watched this proceeding with envy. One athletic leap, and Rose Red was clasping the iron column halfway up. A few more, and she was swinging from the bars under the lantern. But she was accomplished in other ways. She could spin tops, play cat and shinny as well as any of the boys. And as for jumping rope, if two little girls would swing for her, Rosie could actually waltz in the rope. The strangest thing about Rosie was that she did not always go to school like the other children. The incident of the dog happened on Thursday. Friday morning, when the children filed into the schoolhouse, Rosie did not follow them. Instead, she hid herself in a doorway until after the bell rang. A little later, she sneaked out of her hiding place, joined Arthur Duncan at the corner, and disappeared in the distance. Just before 12, they both came back. For a few moments, they kept well concealed on a side street, out of sight of Primrose Court. But at intervals, Rosie or Arthur would dart out to a spot where, without being seen, they could get a glimpse of the church clock. When the children came out of school at 12, they joined the crowd and sauntered home. Monday morning, Maida saw them repeat these maneuvers. She was completely mystified by them, and yet she had an uncomfortable feeling. They were so stealthy that she could not help guessing that something underhand was going on. Do you know Rosie Brine? Maida asked Dickie Dorr one evening when they were reading together. Sure, Dickie's face lighted up. Isn't she a peach? They say she's a tomboy, Maida objected. Is she? Surest thing you know, Dickie said cheerfully. She won't take a dare. You ought to see her playing stumps. There's nothing a boy can do that she won't do. And have you noticed how she can spin a top? The best I ever saw for a girl. Then boys liked girls to be tomboys. This was a great surprise. How does it happen that she doesn't go to school often? Dickie grinned. Hooking Jack. Hooking Jack? Maida repeated in a puzzled tone. Hooking Jack. Playing hooky. Dickie watched Maida's face, but her expression was still puzzled. Pretending to go to school and not going, he said at last. Oh, Maida said. I understand now. She just hates school, Dickie went on. They can't make her go. Old Stupendale, the truant officer, is always after her. Little she cares for old Stoopy, though. She gets fierce beatings for it at home, too. Funny thing about Rosie, she won't tell a lie. And when her mother asks her about it, she always tells the truth. Sometimes, Her mother will go to the schoolhouse door with her every morning and afternoon for a week. But the moment she stops, Rosie begins the hook jack again. Mercy me, Maida said. In all her short life, she had never heard anything like this. She was convinced that Rosie Brine was a very naughty little girl, and yet, underneath this conviction, burned an admiration for her. She must be very brave, she said soberly. Brave? Well, I guess you'd think so. Arthur Duncan says she's braver than a lot of boys he knows. Arthur and she hook jack together sometimes, and don't they have the good times? They go down to the Navy Yard and over to the Monument Grounds. Sometimes they go over to Boston Common and the Public Garden. Once they walked all the way to Franklin Park, and in the summer they often walk down to Crescent Beach. They say when I get well, I can go with them. Dickie spoke in a wistful tone with which he always related the deeds of stronger children. Maida knew exactly how he felt. She had been torn by the same hopes and despairs. Wouldn't it be grand to be able to do just anything, she said. I'm just beginning to feel as if I could do some of the things I've always wanted to do. I'm going to do them all sometime, Dickie prophesied. Doc O'Brien says so. I think Rosie the beautifulest little girl, Maida said. I wish she'd come into the shop so that I could get acquainted with her. Oh, she'll come in sometime. You see, the WMNT is meeting now, and we're all pretty busy. She's the only girl in it. The WMNT, Maida repeated. What does that mean? I can't tell you, Dickie said regretfully. It's the name of our club. Rosie and Arthur and I are the only ones who belong. After that talk, Maida watched Rosie Brine closer than ever. If she caught a glimpse of the scarlet cape in the distance, it was hard to go on working. She noticed that Rosie seemed very fond of all helpless things. She was always wheeling out the babies in the neighborhood, always feeding the doves and carrying her kitten about on her shoulder, always winning the hearts of other people's dogs, and then trying to induce them not to follow her. It seems strange that she never comes into the shop, Maida said mournfully to Dickie one day. You see, she never has any money to spend, Dickie explained. That's the way her mother punishes her. But sometimes she earns it on the sly taking care of babies. She loves babies, and babies always love her. Delia'll go to her from my mother any time, and as for Betsy Hale, Rosie's the only one who can do anything with her. But a whole week passed, and then one day, to Maida's great delight, the tinkle of the bell preceded the entrance of Rose Red. Let me look at your tops, please, Rosie said, marching to the counter with the usual proud swing of her body. Seen closer, she was even prettier than at a distance. Her smooth olive skin glistened like satin. Her lips showed roses even more brilliant than those that bloomed in her cheeks. A frown between her eyebrows gave her face almost a sullen look, but to offset this, her white teeth turned her smile into a flash of light. Maida lifted all the tops from the window and placed them on the counter. Mind if I try them? Rosie asked. Oh, do. Rosie wound one of them with an expert hand. Then, with a quick dash forward of her whole arm, she threw the top to the floor. It danced there, humming like a whole hive full of bees. Oh, how lovely, Maida exclaimed. Then, in fervent admiration, what a wonderful girl you are. Rosie smiled. Easy as pie if you know how. Want to learn? Oh, will you teach me? Sure. Begin now. Maida limped from behind the counter. Rosie watched her. Rosie's face softened with the same pity that had shone on the frightened little dog. She's sorry for me, Maida thought. But Rosie said nothing about Maida's limp. She explained the process of top spinning from end to end, step by step, making Maida copy everything that she did. At first, Maida was too eager, her hands actually trembled. But gradually, she gained in confidence, and at last, she succeeded in making one top spin feebly. Now you've got the hang of it, Rosie encouraged her. You'll soon learn. All you want to do is to practice. I'll come tomorrow and see how you're getting on. Oh, do, Maida begged, and come to see me in the evening sometime. Come this evening if your mother will let you. Rosie laughed scornfully. I guess nobody's got anything to say about letting me if I make up my mind to come. Well, goodbye. She whirled out of the shop, and soon the scarlet cape was a brilliant spot in the distance. But about 7 that evening, the bell rang. When Maida opened the door, there stood Rosie. Oh, Rosie, Maida said joyfully, throwing her arms about her guest. How glad I am to see you. She hurried her into the living room where Billy Potter was talking with Granny. This is Rosie Brine, Billy, she said, her voice full of pride in her new friend. And this is Billy Potter, Rosie. Billy shook hands gravely with the little girl, and Rosie looked at him in open wonder. Maida knew exactly what she was thinking. Rosie was trying to make up her mind whether he was a boy or a man. The problem seemed to grow more perplexing as the evening went on. For part of the time, Billy played with them, sitting on the floor like a boy, and part of the time, he talked with Granny, sitting in a chair like a man. Maida showed Rosie her books, her Venetian beads, all her cherished possessions. Rosie liked the canaries better than anything. Just think of having 6, she said. Then, sitting upstairs in Maida's bedroom, the 2 little girls had a long confidential talk. I've been just crazy to know you, Maida, Rosie confessed. But there was no way of getting acquainted, for you always stayed in the store. I had to wait until I could tease my mother to buy me a top. That's funny, Maida said, for I was just wild to know you. I kept hoping that you'd come in. I hope you'll come often, Rosie, for I don't know any other girl of my own age. You know Laura Lathrop, don't you? Rosie asked with a sideways look. Yes, but I don't like her. Nobody likes her, Rosie said. She's too much of a smarty cat. She loves to get people over there and then show off before them. And then she puts up so many airs. I won't have anything to do with her. From the open window came the shrill scream of Miss Allison's parrot. What do you think of that? It called over and over again. Isn't that a clever bird? Rosie asked admiringly. His name is Tony. I have lots of fun with him. Did you ever see a parrot that could talk before? Oh, yes. We have several at Pride's. Pride's? Pride's Crossing. That's where we go summers. And what do your parrots say? One talked in French. He used to say, taisez-vous, so much that sometimes we would have to put a cover over the cage to stop him. And did you have other animals besides parrots? Rosie asked. I love animals. Oh, yes, we had horses and dogs and cats and rabbits and dancing mice and marmosets and macaws and parakeets, and I guess I've forgotten some of them. But if you like animals, you ought to go to our place in the Adirondacks. There are deer preserves there, and pheasants and peacocks. Who do they belong to? My father. Rosie considered this. Does he keep a bird place? She asked in a puzzled tone. No, Maida's tone was a little puzzled too. She did not know what a bird place was. Well, did he sell them? I don't think he ever sold any. He gave a great many away, though. When Rosie went home, Maida walked as far as her gate with her. Want to know a secret, Maida? Rosie asked suddenly, her eyes dancing with mischief. Oh, yes, I love secrets. Cross your throat, then. Maida did not know how to cross her throat, but Rosie taught her. Well then, Rosie whispered, my mother doesn't know that I went to your house. She sent me to bed for being naughty, and I got up and dressed and climbed out of my window onto the shed without anybody knowing it. She'll never know the difference. Oh, Rosie, Maida said in a horrified tone. Please never do it again. In spite of herself, Maida's eyes twinkled. But Rosie only laughed. Maida watched her steal into her yard, watched her climb over the shed, and watched her disappear through the window. But she grieved over the matter as she walked home. Perhaps it was because she was thinking so deeply that she did not notice how quiet they all were in the living room. But as she crossed the threshold, a pair of arms seized her and swung her into the air. Oh, Papa, she whispered, cuddling her face against his. How glad I am to see you. He marched with her over to the light. Well, little shopkeeper, he said after a long pause in which he studied her keenly. You're beginning to look like a real live girl. He dropped her gently to her feet. Now, show me your shop. And as the story now comes to an end, a pleasant feeling of drowsiness begins to spread through you. From the top of your head, all the way down to the tips of your toes. Your head feels sleepy. Your neck and shoulders feel sleepy. Your arms and legs feel sleepy. Your whole body and your mind feel so relaxed, so at peace. And it's so easy to drift deeper and deeper down into that blissful, dreamy state. That's right. Floating and drifting, drifting and floating, being carried ever so gently, like on a wave, lulled back and forth into a calm and tranquil sleep, floating, drifting and floating, feeling so peaceful, feeling relaxed, feeling at ease, taking you down, all the way down into a calm and tranquil sleep.